October 1942. A German Panzer III advances cautiously through a cleared minefield corridor near El Alamein, following the path marked by British mine detectors hours earlier. The tank commander has watched sappers sweep the route. He has seen mines lifted and stacked at the corridor edges. The path is safe. His tank rolls forward at 15 kilometers per hour. The left track passes over a buried pressure plate positioned precisely where a cleared mine had been photographed by reconnaissance aircraft that morning. The explosion lifts the 30-ton tank 3 meters into the air. The track separates. The suspension collapses. The crew survives, but the tank will not move again under its own power. Recovery vehicles attempting to reach it trigger additional mines placed specifically along likely recovery routes. 2 more vehicles are disabled. The minefield the Germans thought had been cleared was never cleared at all. British engineers had created an elaborate deception, removing visible mines while placing new ones in patterns that mimicked cleared corridors. The technique was called minefield simulation, and between 1941 and 1943, it disabled more German armor than some actual minefields achieved through straightforward deployment. The British Army in North Africa faced a mine warfare problem that was tactical and psychological. German forces had learned to detect and breach British minefields with increasing efficiency. Sappers would locate mines using detectors, mark safe corridors, and clear paths for armor advances. Once breached, a minefield lost most of its defensive value. British defensive doctrine relied heavily on minefields to channel enemy attacks into killing zones, but this strategy failed when the channels could be opened reliably. What British engineers needed was a method to make cleared minefields dangerous again, to render enemy mine-clearing efforts not just ineffective but actively counterproductive, and to force German forces to treat every apparently safe corridor as potentially lethal. The concept required making deception indistinguishable from reality and exploiting the enemy's own competence against them. Development occurred informally among Royal Engineer field companies in late 1941, driven by combat necessity rather than formal doctrine. The technique began with the observation that German reconnaissance aircraft photographed British minefields extensively before attacks, documenting mine positions and cleared corridors. German sappers used these photographs to verify their detector work and confirm safe routes. British engineers realized that if they could manipulate what reconnaissance photographed, they could manipulate what German forces believed was safe. The method required precise coordination between mine-laying, removal, and replacement operations, timed to enemy reconnaissance schedules. It also required mines that could be emplaced quickly in ground that had been recently disturbed by clearing operations, making fresh placement appear as though mines had always been present. The standard British anti-tank mine was the Mark V, a metal-cased device containing approximately 4.5 kilograms of high explosive. Diameter was 320 millimeters, height 130 millimeters. The pressure plate required approximately 90 kilograms of force to detonate, sufficient that personnel could walk over it safely, but vehicles would trigger it reliably. The mine could be buried at depths up to 100 millimeters below surface level and remained functional even when partially flooded. Placement required excavating a hole, positioning the mine, arming the fuse, and concealing it with soil compacted to appear undisturbed. An experienced sapper could emplace one mine in approximately 8 minutes under field conditions. Removal required careful excavation, fuse disarming, and extraction, taking approximately 12 minutes per mine. The simulation technique required both operations to be performed sequentially in coordinated patterns. The process began with laying a standard defensive minefield in documented patterns, typically rows of mines spaced at intervals calculated to maximize coverage while conserving limited stocks. Once laid, the minefield was photographed by British reconnaissance, establishing the baseline that German intelligence would eventually acquire through aerial observation or captured documents. When defensive positions were threatened and German reconnaissance became active, British sappers would enter the minefield and remove selected mines from specific corridors, leaving obvious excavation marks and stacking removed mines visibly at corridor edges. This created clear photographic evidence of mine-clearing activity. The removed mines were real and functional, making any German detector sweeps of the cleared area confirm that no mines remained in the corridor. This phase typically occurred in daylight when German reconnaissance flights were most likely. After dark, different sapper teams would re-enter the apparently cleared corridors and emplace new mines in locations offset slightly from the original positions. These replacement mines were buried more carefully, with disturbed soil removed entirely and replaced with soil from undisturbed areas, eliminating visual cues. The replacement mines used delayed action fuses or pressure plates set to detonate only after multiple passes, allowing initial German detector sweeps or probe vehicles to pass safely while triggering when heavier vehicles or formations advanced. The technique could be enhanced by placing mines specifically along the edges of cleared corridors where vehicles would travel to avoid the area where mines had been photographed, or along likely recovery routes where disabled vehicles would be retrieved. Operational deployment began in mid-1942 during the Gazala battles. British defensive positions incorporated simulated cleared corridors that appeared safe to German reconnaissance, but contained functional mines positioned to maximize psychological impact. Initial successes were documented when German armor advancing through apparently cleared routes suffered unexpected casualties. German after-action reports from this period note increased caution when traversing cleared minefields and complaints that British mine positions did not match intelligence photographs. This confusion was precisely the intended effect. German forces could not determine which corridors were genuinely safe and which were a deception, forcing them to treat all routes as potentially dangerous and slowing their breaching operations significantly. The psychological impact multiplied the tactical effect. German sappers who had cleared a corridor and verified it was safe with detectors found their work invalidated when mines detonated anyway. This created distrust of their own procedures and equipment. Commanders faced the impossible choice between trusting cleared routes and accepting that clearing provided no safety guarantee. Some German units began refusing to use cleared corridors entirely, forcing them to breach new routes which consumed time and resources. Other units advanced through cleared corridors with extreme caution, negating the speed advantage that breaching was meant to provide. Both responses achieved British defensive objectives by slowing enemy advances and creating uncertainty. Comparison with German mine warfare practices reveals asymmetry in approach. German minefields were engineered for permanence and documentation. Precise records were maintained of mine positions, types, and quantities. Clearing procedures assumed that documented positions matched actual positions. This precision made German minefields effective but predictable. British doctrine had always been more flexible, accepting less precise documentation in exchange for adaptability. The simulation technique exploited this difference. British engineers could modify minefields rapidly because their original placement was less rigidly documented. German engineers struggled to understand minefields that did not conform to logical patterns or whose cleared corridors were unreliable. There were significant limitations. The technique required twice the labor of standard mining, as mines were placed, removed, and replaced. It required maintaining operational security so that observation of the replacement phase did not compromise the deception. German forces could potentially detect the deception through intensive detector sweeping that covered entire areas rather than just suspected mine positions, though this was time-consuming and exposed sappers to defensive fire. Most critically, the technique required sufficient mine stocks to both create the initial minefield and provide replacement mines. British mine production in 1941 and 1942 struggled to meet demand, allocating mines to deception operations rather than straightforward defensive employment, a difficult resource decision. The effectiveness declined as German forces adapted. By late 1942, German doctrine emphasized clearing entire areas rather than just specific corridors, which reduced vulnerability to offset replacement mines. German intelligence began analyzing patterns in British mine casualties to determine which cleared corridors were genuine and which were likely deceptions. Some German units adopted the practice of firing artillery at cleared corridors before advancing, hoping to detonate any replacement mines, though this was only partially effective. The technique remained useful, but required constant innovation to stay ahead of countermeasures. Documentation of specific incidents is limited because mine warfare records are fragmentary, and because successful deceptions often went unrecognized as such. German units reporting mine casualties in cleared areas typically attributed them to faulty clearing procedures or detector failures rather than deliberate deception. British after-action reports mention mine simulation operations, but rarely provide detailed casualty figures. Estimates based on unit records suggest that simulated minefields achieved casualty rates approximately 40% of those of standard minefields, while requiring approximately 60% fewer mines per casualty inflicted, making them resource-efficient when properly executed. The technique spread beyond North Africa. British forces in Italy and later in Northwest Europe employed variations of mine simulation, adapted to different terrain and operational contexts. The fundamental principle, creating false safety to exploit enemy confidence, remained constant. Post-war mine warfare doctrine incorporated deception as a standard component of defensive mining operations, though the specific simulation techniques evolved as detection technology improved. Modern mine warfare includes extensive deception elements, all descended from the improvised methods developed by British sappers in the North African desert. The German tank commander whose Panzer detonated a mine in a cleared corridor never learned that the minefield his sappers had spent hours clearing had been restored overnight specifically to target vehicles like his. The British engineers who emplaced the replacement mine never knew which vehicle they would destroy or when. The deception worked not because of sophisticated technology, but because it exploited the assumption that cleared ground stayed cleared, that documented enemy positions remained static, and that hard-won tactical information retained its value over time. The mine that disabled the Panzer had been buried 6 hours before detonation in ground that German detectors had swept clean 12 hours earlier. The corridor was both safe and lethal, depending entirely on the timing that the Germans could not control or predict.